Dr. Ethan Collier stepped off the shuttle and onto the soft, shimmering sands of Vantari Prime's ceremonial landing site. A faint, otherworldly glow surrounded everything, the iridescent sky above, the luminescent tide stretching out to the horizon, and the tall spires of the alien capital city which seemed to hum faintly in the distance. It was breathtaking, unlike any place Ethan had seen in his years of interstellar diplomacy. Yet, as he stood in the designated human delegation area, his colleagues shuffled about, stiff and cautious, following protocol to the letter. Protocol was all they had spoken about on the long flight over. How to stand. How to bow. What to say, more accurately, what not to say. The Vantari, they had been told, had customs as intricate as their crystalline architecture, and the delegation's job was to avoid offense at all costs. This included one unbreakable rule: no one was to speak directly to the Queen. Communication would go through her vizier or designated attendants. The Queen herself was to remain aloof, a symbol of her people's dignity and authority. Ethan hadn't intended to break that rule. The Queen entered the ceremonial chamber a few moments after the human delegation had taken their places. The room, made of polished quartz-like stone, refracted light in dazzling patterns. Her arrival was almost imperceptible at first. There was no grand announcement, no blaring of alien trumpets. Instead, a subtle shift in the atmosphere marked her presence. The air felt heavier, the light seemed to bend more sharply, and then she appeared, tall, radiant, with deep golden eyes that glimmered with intelligence and a hint of weariness. Her intricate robes sparkled faintly as she moved, a blend of organic materials and advanced fabrics. "Dr. Collier, isn't it?" whispered Joseph Klein, Ethan's colleague and the delegation's cultural liaison. He leaned in slightly, adjusting his stiff collar. "Just remember what we talked about. No direct address. We let her vizier handle everything." Ethan nodded absently. He was already captivated by the Queen's presence. Though he knew the rule, a small voice in the back of his mind nagged at him. She seemed isolated, as if the formal structure of the meeting placed her in a glass case. The vizier, a gaunt Vantari male with delicate, flickering antennae, began the ceremonial exchange. He spoke in Vantari first, a language full of trills and resonant tones, and then the human interpreter, a woman named Dr. Maria Alcott, translated each phrase into English. "Our Queen welcomes you," said Alcott, her voice steady. "She hopes this will mark the beginning of a fruitful exchange between our peoples." Joseph Klein took a small step forward, cleared his throat, and recited his own prepared statement. "On behalf of Earth, we thank the Vantari for their gracious invitation. It is our honor to meet you, and we hope to learn much from this partnership." Ethan barely heard the words. He was watching the Queen's expression. While Klein spoke, her face remained still, neither displeased nor engaged. When the vizier translated into Vantari, she nodded slightly, but her eyes flickered across the room, never settling on one person for long. To Ethan, it looked like she was scanning the space, searching for something or someone that wasn't there. Then came the exchange of gifts. The human delegation presented a carefully chosen piece of art, a glass sculpture that mirrored the patterns of Vantari crystalline structures crafted by one of Earth's foremost artisans. It was meant to be a gesture of respect, symbolizing the human admiration for Vantari culture. The Queen acknowledged it with a slight tilt of her head. Her vizier responded with a few melodic tones, which Dr. Alcott translated as a formal acceptance. "Dr. Collier," Klein muttered under his breath, "look engaged, but don't say anything. We're almost through this part." Ethan straightened his shoulders and gave a slight nod, though he couldn't help glancing toward the Queen again. The Vantari people had been described in briefing materials as enigmatic, their society built on a delicate balance of tradition and technological advancement. The Queen, they said, was more than a leader, she was a living symbol. But the longer Ethan watched her, the more she seemed like a woman trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. When the ceremony concluded, the Queen turned to leave, her robes flowing behind her in a cascade of light. It was then, just as she passed near him, that Ethan noticed her pause. Her golden eyes met his, briefly but unmistakably. He didn't know what compelled him to do it, but before anyone could stop him, Ethan spoke. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice calm and steady, "what is it you hope to gain from this meeting?" There was an audible intake of breath from the human delegation. Klein visibly stiffened. Even Dr. Alcott looked stricken. No one said a word as the vizier turned slowly, his antennae quivering with what might have been surprise or irritation. Yet it was the Queen who responded, not with anger, but with something like curiosity. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and then she answered, her voice soft but clear. "I hope," she said in English, each word deliberate, "that we can find a way to understand each other better." A murmur went through the Vantari court. The vizier seemed stunned. The Queen glanced at him briefly, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. Then she turned back to Ethan. "You are different from the others," she said, and though her expression remained composed, there was the faintest hint of a smile in her tone. "I'm just curious," Ethan replied, feeling the weight of the room's silence pressing down on him. "Sometimes understanding starts with a question." The Queen tilted her head slightly as if considering his words. "Then perhaps," she said, "we shall have more questions." Before anyone could respond, she stepped away, leaving the chamber. The vizier followed, casting a final glance at Ethan that was difficult to interpret, somewhere between disapproval and intrigue. As soon as the doors closed behind them, Klein rounded on Ethan. "What were you thinking?" "We were specifically told not to address her directly." "She didn't seem upset," Ethan said, though he felt a small surge of guilt. She answered. "Maybe she appreciated it." "That's not the point," Klein interrupted, his voice sharp. "You put the entire delegation in an awkward position. This isn't some casual chat, it's interstellar diplomacy." Dr. Alcott chimed in, her tone more measured. "We'll have to report this. Hopefully it won't have any long-term consequences." Ethan nodded, accepting their reprimands. Yet deep down, he didn't regret it. The Queen had spoken to him, not through an interpreter, not through her vizier, but directly. It was a moment of unfiltered connection, however brief. He couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. Chapter 2, A Shared Language. After the awkwardness of their first meeting, Dr. Ethan Collier found himself under increased scrutiny from both his delegation and the Vantari court. His superiors warned him to tread carefully, while Vantari officials, now more curious than concerned, kept a watchful eye on him. The Queen, however, seemed entirely unbothered by the breach of protocol. In fact, she started speaking to him directly whenever their paths crossed, even if only briefly. Each time she did, it felt as if a chasm between their two worlds narrowed just a little more. Ethan was seated in a small Vantari garden, a space reserved for contemplation and study, when she approached him again. The garden was a quiet sanctuary in the heart of the city, filled with glowing vines that trailed down like waterfalls of light and softly humming crystalline structures that resonated with the wind. He was reviewing a tablet full of Vantari symbols, attempting to learn their written language, when her presence made him glance up. "Dr. Collier," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. "What do you think of our writing?" Ethan rose to his feet, feeling that same unshakable mix of awe and uncertainty. "Your Majesty, it's fascinating, but also challenging. The symbols seem to shift slightly when I look at them too long." She nodded, stepping closer. "That is their nature. Our written language reflects motion, change. It is alive in a way, just as our spoken words carry meaning that depends on tone and intent." He hesitated before speaking again. "I've been studying it, but it's not easy to grasp." The Queen tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. "It is not meant to be simple. We believe that effort shapes understanding. To read a text requires not just the eyes, but the mind and heart. The shifting patterns reflect the complexity of thought." As she spoke, Ethan noticed a hint of warmth in her tone, a genuine interest in whether he understood. He decided to risk a question, hoping not to offend. "Do your people start learning these symbols at a very young age?" She seemed amused by his curiosity. "Yes, from the moment we can perceive light. It becomes a part of us, as natural as breathing. For you, it must feel like learning a new sense." "It does," he admitted. "But I'm eager to understand it. Your language, your culture, it's unlike anything I've encountered before." A pause lingered between them, and then, to Ethan's surprise, she gestured to the bench he had been sitting on. "May I?" He quickly nodded, stepping aside. "Of course." The Queen sat gracefully, her flowing garments settling around her like liquid metal. Ethan hesitated before resuming his seat, unsure if he should stay. She gestured for him to sit again, and he took his place a respectful distance away. "You've been studying diligently," she observed. "Most of your colleagues seem less invested." Ethan shrugged. "I just want to understand. I think there's so much we could learn from each other if we only tried." She regarded him for a moment, as if weighing his sincerity. "You speak as though you value connection over expedience." "Because I do," he said simply. "In the end, what good is a treaty or an agreement if we don't really understand each other? I don't just want to exchange pleasantries. I want to know who you are, who your people are. What drives you, what matters to you." Her golden gaze softened slightly. "You are unusual, Dr. Collier." He smiled faintly. "I get that a lot." Her lips quirked in a subtle expression that might have been amusement. "Perhaps it is a trait your people value." "Not always," Ethan said with a chuckle. "But I think it's worth the trouble. You can't make meaningful connections if you just follow a script. You have to be willing to ask questions even if they're difficult." The Queen considered his words, then nodded. "You would do well among my scholars. They are known for their endless questions." That's a compliment I'll happily accept, Ethan said. Although I think I still have a long way to go before I'd qualify as a Vantari scholar. She stood, her movements as fluid and deliberate as ever. Then you must continue learning. And if you have questions, do not hesitate to ask. Ethan stood as well, caught off guard by the offer. Are you saying I can ask you directly? She met his gaze, her expression calm but with a faint hint of amusement. Yes, Dr. Collier. You may ask. He felt a flicker of unease at what this might mean for his standing among the delegation, but the curiosity in her eyes was impossible to ignore. Thank you, Your Majesty. I'll do my best not to ask anything too foolish. Her tone turned faintly teasing. There are no foolish questions, only foolish refusals to ask. With that, she left the garden, her presence lingering even after she disappeared among the glowing foliage. Ethan stared after her for a moment, then sat down again, his thoughts racing. It wasn't just the allure of learning a new language or understanding a new culture. It was the way she had responded to him, the way she seemed to recognize his genuine desire to connect. She wasn't just a distant figurehead, she was someone who wanted to be seen and understood. He turned back to the shifting symbols on his tablet and began to study again, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. Chapter 3, Stranded Together. The storm arrived with little warning. One moment, the skies over Vantari Prime's rolling plains were their usual shimmering silver. The next, dark clouds twisted out of nowhere, swallowing the sunlight and casting the lush landscape into shadow. Ethan Collier was mid-conversation with a fellow human delegate, Carter Reeves, when the first gusts of wind rattled the temporary base camp's delicate metal frames. Do you feel that? Carter asked, tilting his head as if listening to something far away. Ethan had noticed it too, the air seemed heavier, almost charged. I think we should head inside. This doesn't look normal. Carter was already grabbing a comm device. I'll radio the others. See if they've got any news from the capital. The two of them hurried into the nearest structure, a temporary habitat module, just as the wind intensified. Ethan felt the building sway under the force of the gusts. Carter's voice rose as he spoke into the comm. This is Reeves at Site B. Can anyone confirm what's going on with the weather? Static crackled in response. No answer. Ethan frowned. Could the storm be interfering with communications? Carter shook his head. Vantari weather patterns aren't supposed to behave like this. Something's off. I'll keep trying. Before Carter could finish, the module's lights flickered and a deafening crack of thunder shook the ground. Then the lights went out completely. The module plunged into darkness, save for the faint, shifting glow of the alien flora visible through a nearby viewport. We need to check the generator, Ethan said, already reaching for a portable light. Carter hesitated. If it's this bad here, it's worse outside. Do we have a choice? Ethan asked. Without power, we're completely cut off. Carter grumbled but grabbed a second flashlight. Together, they pushed open the module's door and stepped into the storm. Rain hit them immediately, sharp and cold, driven sideways by the wind. The sky was a swirling vortex of dark gray clouds, lit occasionally by flashes of greenish lightning. Ethan had studied the planet's unique weather cycles during the initial briefings, but nothing he'd read suggested this level of severity. The generator should be in the main outbuilding, he said, pointing through the sheets of rain. I know where it is, Carter snapped. Just keep close. They trudged through the mud, heads down against the wind. The outbuilding was barely visible, its outline blurred by the relentless downpour. When they reached it, Carter yanked the door open and the two men tumbled inside, gasping for breath. The sound of the storm was muted here, though the walls groaned under the force of the wind. Ethan flicked his light around the room. The generator sat in the corner, its control panel dark. He knelt beside it, hands already slick with rain. Can you hold the light steady? Carter held the flashlight over Ethan's shoulder, grumbling under his breath. This weather's insane. I thought we were supposed to be past the storm season. I don't think this is normal for any season, Ethan replied, focusing on the controls. The generator wasn't damaged, just unresponsive. It might be the fuel intake. I need to. Another crack of lightning lit the room, accompanied by a deafening boom. Both men froze as the building shuddered. The storm wasn't letting up. Ethan sighed, leaning back on his heels. We're not getting power back anytime soon. We need to regroup with the others. Assuming they're still at their stations, Carter said grimly. They won't just abandon post, Ethan said, standing and wiping his hands on his already soaked pants. Let's head back and figure out what's going on. Reluctantly, Carter nodded and they braved the storm again. This time, the wind seemed even stronger and Ethan had to shout to be heard. Stay close. I don't want to lose you in this. Carter waved a hand to signal he heard, but the two quickly lost sight of the path. The rain was so heavy now that it felt like walking underwater. The trees and alien vegetation surrounding them glowed faintly, their bioluminescence casting eerie shadows. "I can't see the camp," Carter yelled, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. Ethan stopped, shielding his face with one arm. "We need to find higher ground to get our bearings." Carter nodded, and they pushed toward a nearby hill, clambering over roots and stones. When they reached the top, they paused, breathing hard. The camp's lights were nowhere in sight. All around them, the landscape was a surreal blend of glowing plants and storm-drenched terrain. "This is bad," Carter said, his voice low. Ethan looked at him, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of his flashlight. "It's not ideal, but we'll figure it out." Carter stared at him for a long moment. "You really believe that? Do I have a choice?" Ethan asked, trying to sound lighthearted. Carter actually chuckled, though it was more bitter than amused. "Fair point." They stood there a moment longer before Ethan gestured downhill. "Come on. If we keep moving, we'll find the others, or at least shelter." As they made their way down the slope, Carter spoke again, his tone more thoughtful. "What do you think the Vantari make of all this? Do you think they're watching us, wondering how we'll handle it?" "I think they're as caught off guard as we are," Ethan said. "This storm doesn't feel planned. It feels wrong." Carter nodded but didn't reply. They continued in silence until they spotted a faint light in the distance. It wasn't the camp, it was too small and too orange. As they got closer, they realized it was a natural formation, a patch of bioluminescent rocks clustered together, providing a small, warm glow against the storm's darkness. Ethan dropped to the ground beside it, catching his breath. Carter sank down next to him, stretching out his legs. "What now?" Carter asked. "We wait," Ethan said. "If this storm is as unnatural as it seems, it has to pass eventually. Once it does, we'll head back to camp, find out what went wrong, and go from there." Carter looked skeptical but didn't argue. Instead, he leaned against one of the glowing rocks, closing his eyes. Ethan let his head rest against his knees, his mind racing. The storm wasn't just a freak weather event. Something about it felt deliberate, and the thought made his stomach twist. But for now, they could only wait and hope that the storm would soon end. Chapter 4, Boundaries Blurred. The capital city of the Vantari glowed softly as dusk settled over its towers and walkways. The storm had passed, but the effects lingered. Repairs were underway throughout the sprawling urban center, and both humans and Vantari worked side by side, patching walls and reinforcing structures. For the first time since arriving on this world, Ethan felt like he was part of something larger than himself. Carter Reeves was by his side, cracking jokes and keeping the atmosphere light as they helped replace panels on a damaged observation deck. "Hey, Ethan," Carter said, holding up a smooth slab of crystalline material. "You think this goes on the left or the right?" Ethan looked up from the section he was inspecting. "Left. The pattern matches the other side." Carter squinted at it, then shrugged. "You sure?" "Because complaining. I'm telling them it was your idea." Ethan laughed. "Fair enough." As Carter secured the panel, Ethan's gaze drifted to the streets below. The city was alive with movement, and though the devastation from the storm was evident, there was a surprising amount of collaboration. Humans and Vantari worked together on almost every project. What struck Ethan most was how natural it seemed. Just weeks ago, there had been a subtle tension, an unspoken boundary between the two species. Now, that line felt thinner, almost transparent. "Not bad, huh?" Carter said, stepping back to admire their work. "If we keep this up, we might just get invited to the next big Vantari festival." "Maybe," Ethan said, smiling. "But let's finish the job first." They moved on to the next section, talking as they worked. Carter shared stories from his past assignments. His mishaps, his successes, the occasional cultural faux pas that had landed him in hot water. Ethan listened, chiming in with his own experiences. It felt good to talk freely, without the weight of diplomatic protocol hanging over them. Just as they were finishing the final panel, a familiar voice interrupted their conversation. "Dr. Collier, Mr. Reeves." Both men turned to see Queen Serali standing at the edge of the observation deck, her golden eyes reflecting the fading light. She was flanked by two of her advisors, but her attention was focused squarely on Ethan and Carter. "Your Majesty," Ethan said, inclining his head slightly. Carter followed suit, though his bow was a bit more awkward. Serali stepped closer, her flowing robes catching the breeze. "I see you've been assisting with the repairs." Carter glanced at Ethan before speaking. "Just doing our part, ma'am. Your Majesty." Sorali's lips curved into a faint smile. It's appreciated. The storm caught us all unprepared, but your efforts have not gone unnoticed. Ethan felt a mix of pride and uncertainty. We're glad to help. It's the least we can do after everything that's happened. Sorali nodded, her gaze shifting briefly to the horizon. It is during times of upheaval that true understanding begins to emerge. Wouldn't you agree? Ethan met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them. I would. Working together like this, it shows what's possible. Carter cleared his throat, breaking the moment. So, what's next on the agenda? More panels? Maybe some light demolition work? Sorali turned her attention to Carter, her expression calm. For now, I would suggest a brief rest. You have done enough for the day. Carter grinned. You don't have to tell me twice. I'll head back and see if they've got any of those Vantari tea things ready. You coming, Ethan? Ethan hesitated. I'll join you in a bit. I'd like to finish up here first. Carter gave him a knowing look. Sure thing. Just don't work too hard. As Carter walked off, Sorali stepped closer to Ethan. The two advisors lingered nearby, but the Queen waved them back with a subtle gesture. Ethan felt the atmosphere shift, less formal, more personal. I sense you have questions, she said softly. Ethan looked down at the panel he'd been adjusting. More than a few, to be honest. But I'm not sure where to start. Start with what matters most, she said. What troubles you? He hesitated, then decided to be honest. What I don't understand is why you've been so open with me. Most of the delegation is careful not to speak out of turn, and I get the sense that your own advisors would prefer I stayed silent. But you've encouraged this. Sorali studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Perhaps I see something in you that others do not. You speak not to gain favor or advantage, but to understand. That is rare. Ethan looked at her, caught off guard by the sincerity in her tone. I guess I just don't see the point of being here if we're not going to try to learn from each other. And that, Sorali said, her voice quiet but firm, is why I encourage it. The formalities have their place, but progress is born from connection. You and Mr. Reeves exemplify this. Working together, sharing experiences. This is how we move forward. Ethan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. I never thought of it that way. Sorali's gaze softened. Then perhaps you are beginning to see as we see. A comfortable silence settled between them. Ethan could hear the faint hum of the city below, the occasional chirp of alien birds darting through the air. He realized how rare it was to have a moment like this. Just two people talking, without the weight of politics or protocol. Thank you, he said finally. She tilted her head slightly. For what? For answering my questions. For trusting me enough to have this conversation. Sorali's smile was faint but genuine. It is I who should thank you, Dr. Collier. Your questions remind me why I lead, and your actions remind me what is possible when we dare to connect. As she turned to leave, Ethan watched her go, feeling a strange mix of respect and warmth. The boundary between their worlds had blurred, if only a little, and in that blurring, something new had begun to take shape. Chapter 5, A Fragile Harmony. Ethan Collier ducked under the low-hanging arch of an ancient Vantari ruin, brushing aside thick, glowing vines that clung to the stone. He and Carter Reeves had been tasked with cataloging artifacts unearthed by the recent storms, artifacts that told the story of a long-forgotten era on Vantari Prime. As they stepped into the chamber, the temperature dropped slightly, and the air seemed to hum with a faint resonance. Remind me why we're the ones doing this? Carter muttered, adjusting his pack. Because we volunteered, Ethan replied, kneeling by a crystalline sculpture embedded in the wall. Remember? We'll help wherever we're needed, you said. Carter rolled his eyes. I meant fetching supplies, maybe repairing a few rooftops, not spelunking through glowing alien ruins. Ethan glanced back at him with a smirk. Too late now. Besides, don't you want to see what's in here? Not as much as I want lunch, Carter grumbled, but he joined Ethan at the wall. As the two worked, their comm units buzzed intermittently. The storm had caused some of the long-range relays to malfunction, so communication between teams was spotty at best. They took turns brushing debris off intricate carvings, trying to decipher their meaning. Carter, who had a knack for reading subtle patterns, pointed out repeating motifs, a series of interlocking triangles with a central circular glyph. "Think it's some kind of warning?" he asked, tracing the pattern with his gloved hand. Ethan shook his head. "Not sure. Could be ceremonial. The Vantari don't seem big on outright warnings. They're more likely to encode meaning into art and let you figure it out for yourself." "That's frustratingly vague. Welcome to interspecies anthropology." Carter chuckled. "Well, if this is ceremonial, what do you think they were celebrating? A good harvest? The birth of a leader?" Ethan squinted at the glyph. "Maybe it's something more foundational. A record of when this city was first built or when their society unified." As they debated, a faint noise echoed through the chamber. Both men froze. "Did you hear that?" Carter whispered. Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows. The sound came again, a low, rhythmic clicking. It was too regular to be natural, yet it didn't match any known Vantari tool or machine. Carter instinctively reached for the small shock baton he carried, while Ethan slowly stood, keeping his hands visible. "Could be an old defense system," Ethan said quietly. "Something that triggered after we moved those vines." "Great," Carter muttered. "And here I thought we were the friendly archaeologists." The clicking grew louder, accompanied by a faint glow from a previously dark corridor. Both men turned toward the source, but before they could react further, a familiar voice broke the tension. "Dr. Collier." "Mr. Reeves." It was Queen Serali. She stepped into the chamber from the glowing corridor, her robes shimmering faintly. The clicking stopped instantly. "Your Majesty?" Ethan said, both surprised and relieved. "What are you doing down here?" "I could ask you the same," she replied, a hint of amusement in her tone. "But I see you have discovered a chamber of great significance." Carter relaxed visibly, lowering the baton. "You could have told us you were down here, Your Majesty. We almost had a heart attack." Serali's lips curved in a faint smile. "I was not aware that I needed to report my movements to you, Mr. Reeves." "Fair point," Carter said, rubbing the back of his neck. Ethan approached her carefully. "We were sent to catalog artifacts exposed by the storm. Is this chamber safe to explore?" She glanced at the wall carvings, then nodded. "It is. The storm uncovered parts of our history that have been buried for generations. I came to ensure that nothing of value was lost." Ethan exchanged a glance with Carter. "So, the clicking we heard?" "A mechanism," Serali explained. "It activates when certain pathways are cleared. It is harmless, though I admit it can be startling." Carter exhaled audibly. "Good to know. I thought we tripped some ancient booby trap." The Queen's gaze lingered on Ethan. "Your curiosity is commendable, but you must be cautious. This chamber contains knowledge not yet fully understood even by my people." "Understood," Ethan said. "We'll proceed carefully." Serali stepped closer, her attention shifting to the glyphs on the wall. "This tells a story of a time before our current age. A time when our world was divided and these symbols represented unity." Ethan studied her expression. "Is that why you came down here? To remind yourself of that unity?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment he thought he saw something unguarded, something vulnerable. "I came because I felt it was important. Sometimes the past holds answers to questions we have not yet asked." Carter, sensing the shift in mood, cleared his throat. "I'll, take another look around. See if there's anything we missed." As Carter moved to another part of the chamber, Serali turned to Ethan. "You are not like the others in your delegation." "I've heard that before," Ethan said with a wry smile. "It is not a criticism," she said. "You speak freely. You seek understanding rather than advantage. It is unusual." Ethan leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "Is that why you've been so open with me? Because I'm unusual." Serali's lips curved faintly. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I find your perspective refreshing." "Refreshing," he repeated as if testing the word. "You challenge assumptions," she said. "Even now, as we stand in this chamber, you question not only what these symbols mean, but why they matter. That is rare." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I don't think I'm doing anything special. I just want to understand your history, your culture. You." Serali's gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned back to the glyphs. "Understanding takes time. It is not something achieved in a single conversation or a single visit. It requires patience." "I have patience," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "I'm willing to learn." Serali's expression softened and she nodded. "Then let us continue to learn from each other." Carter's voice called out from the far side of the chamber. "Hey, I think I found another one of those glowing triangle things. It's half buried, but it looks intact." Serali glanced in Carter's direction, then back at Ethan. Your companion is quite determined. He is, Ethan said with a grin. It's one of his best qualities. She inclined her head slightly. Perhaps you chose well in working with him. I'd like to think so. Sarali stepped back, her gaze once more on the carvings. You may continue your work here, but proceed carefully. There is much we have yet to uncover. Ethan nodded. We will. As she turned to leave, Ethan felt a strange sense of gratitude. The Queen had shown him trust, not just in words but in allowing him to remain in this sacred space. It wasn't something he would take lightly. Chapter 6, A New Path. The final phase of the Vantari capital's recovery effort brought Ethan Collier and Carter Reeves to the edge of the city. Beyond the shimmering crystalline towers lay a vast, undisturbed expanse of wilderness, rolling hills dotted with bioluminescent vegetation and rivers that glowed faintly under the stars. The two men were tasked with mapping out potential new trade routes that would connect remote settlements to the rebuilt infrastructure. It was, in theory, a straightforward assignment, but the landscape proved more challenging than either of them had expected. I thought you said this was going to be a simple hike, Carter grumbled as he struggled to navigate a narrow trail. This path is barely a foot wide. Ethan, walking ahead, glanced back over his shoulder. It looked simple on the map. I didn't realize the vegetation would be this thick. Thick? This stuff's practically alive, Carter said, ducking under a glowing vine that seemed to pulse as he passed it. Feels like it's watching us. Ethan chuckled. Maybe it is. You've seen how the Vantari view their environment. Everything's connected: plants, animals, people. Nothing's just there for decoration. Carter snorted. Great. Just what I needed, sentient shrubs judging my hiking skills. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the terrain became more rugged. The ground beneath their boots shifted between patches of soft moss that seemed to hum faintly and stretches of jagged, alien rock. Despite Carter's complaints, the two made good progress, stopping occasionally to scan the area with portable mapping devices. Let's set up here, Ethan said as they reached a small clearing. He dropped his pack and began unpacking their equipment. Carter followed suit, sitting heavily on a large, smooth stone. You know, Carter said, watching Ethan work, this would be a lot easier if the Vantari just built some roads. Ethan looked up, raising an eyebrow. You want them to start paving over their sacred land? Carter shrugged. Not paving. Maybe just, I don't know, some marked paths? It's not like anyone's living out here. Yet, Ethan replied. That's the whole point of these routes, connecting the city to new settlements. They'll need infrastructure, but it has to be done carefully. The Vantari won't just bulldoze their way through. Carter shook his head. Sometimes I wonder how you got so deep into their culture. You think like one of them half the time. Ethan smiled faintly. I don't think that's a bad thing. Carter let out a short laugh. No, it's not bad. It's just different. I've been on missions where the locals wouldn't give us the time of day. Here, you're sitting down with their queen, swapping philosophies. It's not just me, Ethan said, returning to the equipment. You've been out here just as much as I have. You've worked alongside them, gotten to know their customs. Carter gave him a long look. Yeah, but it's not the same. They respect you in a way I don't see with anyone else. Even the queen now. Sarali, Ethan interrupted, glancing up. Yeah, her, Carter said. She treats you like an equal. Like someone she can actually talk to. Ethan hesitated, then returned to adjusting the mapping device. I think she just sees the effort we're putting in. It's not about me personally. Carter rolled his eyes. Sure. Keep telling yourself that. Before Ethan could respond, a rustling sound came from the underbrush. Both men froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their sidearms. A moment later, a figure emerged, Queen Sarali, flanked by two attendants who stayed a respectful distance behind. Ethan stood quickly, his expression shifting from surprise to calm respect. Your Majesty, we weren't expecting you. Sarali inclined her head, her golden eyes catching the faint light from the bioluminescent plants. I thought it might be useful to see the area for myself. The new trade routes will affect all of us after all. Carter scrambled to his feet, giving her a slightly awkward bow. Of course. The more input we have, the better. Sarali's gaze moved from Carter to Ethan. I see you have made progress. We've identified several potential routes, Ethan said, gesturing to the mapping equipment. But the terrain is more challenging than we anticipated. She stepped closer, examining the device. And how do you propose to overcome these challenges? Ethan exchanged a glance with Carter. We'll need to work with your engineers to find solutions. There are areas that could be reinforced without disrupting the environment and sections that might be better served by alternative paths. Collaboration, Sarali said softly as if testing the word. A worthwhile approach. She looked out at the wilderness beyond the clearing, her expression thoughtful. This land is precious to my people. It must be treated with care. Ethan nodded. We understand that. The goal isn't just efficiency, it's balance. We don't want to impose human methods that don't respect the Vantari way of life. Sarali turned back to him, a faint smile playing at her lips. You continue to surprise me, Dr. Collier. Carter coughed, breaking the moment. So, what's next? Should we move on to the next potential route? Sarali's smile widened slightly. Not just yet. I would like to hear more about your observations. What have you learned from this wilderness that you did not expect? Carter hesitated, then shrugged. Honestly, it's alive. Not just biologically, but in a way that feels aware. Like it knows we're here. Sarali nodded, as if his words confirmed something she already believed. The land remembers those who walk upon it. It responds to our presence. Ethan glanced at her. And do you think it approves of what we're doing? She met his gaze, her golden eyes calm and steady. I think it is watching, and it will judge us by our actions. The weight of her words settled over them, and for a moment, the clearing was silent. Then Carter spoke up, his tone lighter. Well, if that's the case, let's make sure we leave a good impression. No trampling the sacred bushes. Ethan smiled, grateful for the break in tension. Agreed. Let's move carefully and document everything. That way, we can show that we're trying to do this the right way. Sarali watched them for a moment longer, then nodded. I will leave you to your work, but know that I will be observing your progress closely. Of course, Your Majesty, Ethan said. Thank you for your guidance. As she turned to leave, Carter waited until she was out of earshot before shaking his head. I don't know how you do it, man. Do what? Ethan asked. Keep your cool when she's standing there, looking at you like she's reading your soul. Ethan chuckled. You get used to it. Sure, Carter muttered. I'm still working on that part. The two men returned to their mapping, the faint glow of the wilderness around them feeling less like an obstacle and more like a companion. They worked side by side, sharing observations and ideas, the silence between them comfortable. As they finished marking the day's final potential route, Ethan glanced back toward the direction Sarali had gone, wondering if she truly believed they could find the balance she spoke of. Carter's voice broke his thoughts. Ready to call it a day? Ethan nodded, packing up.